Hey guys, welcome to another lesson. While you're working on reading books 7 and 8 of the Aeneid, we're going to take a little time out from the Aeneid to look at some Roman poetry from one of the most prominent Roman poets, and some that I think will relate to some of what we read about Dido and Aeneas in book 4 in particular. So we're going to dive into that, and we're going to look at the poetry of the Roman poet Catullus. And so we're going to talk a little bit about his life today, about the themes of many of his poems, about some of the other works that he's written, and then you're going to have the chance to look at 4 short poems by him that are mostly themed around the same thing, although there is one that has a slightly different theme. And then you'll give some response to some of that poetry. So hopefully you can see some of the connections between these works and the Aeneid, and also just get a flavor for some of the ancient Roman poetry. All right, so we're looking at the poet Gaius Valerius Catullus. Don't you love those really, really long, complicated Roman names? Thankfully, for short, he's simply known as Catullus. Catullus was born in the city of Verona, which if you've ever read or watched Romeo and Juliet, you may recognize the name of that city. It is an Italian city, and it is the city in which the story of Romeo and Juliet is set. So he was born in the city of Verona. We know that. Most of what we know about his life is pieced together from his own works. There are a few outside sources that give us a few details about who he is and what his life was like. But the rest of most of what we know is pieced together from his works. And there are some things that I will be pointing out that we don't even know for sure, although they are kind of the most popular and most prominent theories. So he was born in Verona. He seems to have come from a prosperous and very well-connected family. One author says that Julius Caesar was a close family friend, especially of Catullus's father. And so he seems to have had kind of a leg up in the world, right? That his family kind of helped him on his way to a career in which he would become one of the most well-known and respected poets in Rome. He lived during the late Republic era, as you could tell from his family being friends with Julius Caesar, so kind of the last generation of the Republic before Rome transitioned into an empire. So he's a little bit before, he's during the time of Virgil, probably a little bit older than Virgil. Virgil was probably growing up a little bit later in that process. So as a young man, he decided to move to Rome. Most likely this was just because if you wanted to make it as a writer, you had to be in Rome. And so when he moved to Rome, his family provided letters of introductions to all kind of the wealthy social elite in Rome so that he could get into the most prestigious circles and kind of jumpstart his career in that way. Catullus seems to have been witty, wealthy, and well-educated. As we can tell, probably well-educated, both just from his excellence as a writer, but from a wealthy family. We can also assume that they provided him with a good education. He sometimes portrayed himself as kind of a starving poet, someone who was just barely making ends meet with his writing, but that's not entirely an accurate perspective, given the fact that he owned several estates, he had a private library in Rome, he had his own personal yacht. He probably was quite well-to-do, perhaps not as crazy well-to-do as some of his friends, but he was very well off. He was always welcome in the homes of the rich and elegant in Rome, and he frequented those circles, and people in those circles seemed to form much of the subject of his poetry. So if we're going to talk about the poetry of Catullus, we need to talk about another person who's an important figure in his life. In many of his poems, he is writing love poems to and about a woman that he calls Lesbia. Now, Lesbia is probably a made-up name, a pseudonym for a real person. The name Lesbia comes from some of the poetry that Catullus most admired from ancient Greece, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. We don't know for certain who Lesbia was, aside from the fact that she was his lover. We don't really know anything beyond that. So scholars have theorized and wondered about that. And so the most popular theory is that she was this woman named Clodia Metelli. Clodia Metelli was kind of the leader of the most glamorous social circle in Rome. At the time, we know a lot about her from the Roman author Cicero. She was descended from a very, very old noble family, a aristocratic family in the Roman Republic. She had been married to a powerful man, though it seems by the time Cicero is writing that she has become widowed, though her husband was possibly still alive while Catullus was around. And so all of that kind of made her a very prominent woman in ancient Rome. She was a very important social figure, and she was kind of seen as the epitome of high society. Think of her as a Kardashian in ancient Rome. That would be perhaps the kind of closest analogy that we could make. So she combined her social position and her wealth and her very chic sense of beauty in order to exercise a lot of influence on culture and society in ancient Rome. And so a lot of the social circle of the wealthy elite that Catullus was traveling in would have centered around Clodia Metelli and her brother, who were both very popular and kind of set the tone for what was going on in Rome at the time, culturally speaking. Clodia Metelli, especially as described by Cicero, seems to have been a notorious flirt. And Cicero kind of condemns her for having had a number of affairs while her husband was alive. That she was not a moral woman, right? That she was kind of very loose with herself. Cicero was a very kind of straight-laced man. He very much believed in a strong sense of morality and a moral code, and so this disturbed him about Clodia Metelli. Cicero even compared her to Medea and Clytemnestra, who were women who murdered members of their family. So you can see that Cicero had very, very strong opinions about her. And so you can imagine that if, in fact, the woman that Catullus refers to as Lesbia is Clodia Metelli, that's going to be kind of an up and down and pretty rocky relationship, one in which she's kind of toying with him and his emotions. And that is in fact kind of the love story overall that we get from Catullus's love poetry, if you read it all together, is kind of this progression of being in love to eventually feeling used and abandoned by the woman that he loves. And so that probably has played into the fact that many scholars believe that Clodia Metelli may be the woman that Catullus is referring to, though we will probably never know that for certain. So Catullus seems to have been ensnared by Clodia's charms, or at least this other woman, if it was not Clodia. He writes dazzling, passionate love poems to her, which eventually turn into these kind of embittered expressions of love thwarted and rejected. And I think there's a kind of a lot of lesson to be learned from Catullus's mistakes there, right? He kind of learns the hard way what the real price of adultery and affairs are, and he captures that kind of hurt and that downfall of these affairs and adulterous relationships in his poetry. And so, although I certainly don't condone what Catullus did, I believe firmly in sexual relationship happening only inside of a monogamous marriage. But I think Catullus's poetry can provide us with a lesson, one of those lessons in what not to do, because he experiences the hurt and pain that causes, and probably regretted having pursued that path. Catullus does refer to this woman as Lesbia, as I mentioned before. In part, if it is Clodia Metelli, who was a very public figure, this might have been to hide her identity, because she may have been trying to maintain kind of a front of being a good moral person, even though she wasn't behind the scenes. Although, if she was trying to maintain that front, she failed. Cicero seems to have found her out. One of the other reasons that he refers to her as that is to honor the Greek poetess Sappho. We read some of the poetry of Sappho when we were studying Greek literature, and we know that Sappho had her home on the island of Lesbos, where she taught poetry and music to a group of young women. And so his naming her Lesbia is simply in honor of Sappho, who seems to be one of his very early poetic inspirations. He seems to have drawn a lot of his poetic style from Sappho's poetic style. And so it is a way to kind of hide the identity of the woman he loves, but it's also a way to honor one of the poets that he really looks up to. So we're going to look here at some of Catullus's different works. And he has a number of different works that he produced. He's most famous for his love lyrics. And these convey very, very strong emotions. It's almost like reading a diary entry. His emotions are just so raw. And so it's easy to forget that these are actually very carefully crafted pieces of poetry, that he's really worked on these, and he's not just kind of spilling his guts on the page. But he manages to capture that kind of initial feeling of if somebody were just writing in their diary and just kind of spilling their raw emotion onto the page. That's the kind of feel that you get from his poetry, even though they're very carefully crafted works. And he conveys very, very mixed emotions as we trace the progression of his relationship with Lesbia. It moves from ecstatic happiness when she returns his love to depression and bitterness when he's rejected by her. So there's kind of a whole wide range of emotions that he expresses in his poems, and they're all communicated very powerfully and very skillfully. He has some works of political commentary, some satire, and some scathing kind of works that really point out some of the flaws and problems in the political system in his day. The late Roman Republic era was a very broken political era. There was the Roman Republic was not functioning the way it should have, which is why it eventually kind of fell and gave rise to an empire under Caesar Augustus. And so he wrote some political attacks, kind of pointing out some of the problems, including attacking Julius Caesar. You may remember that I mentioned earlier that Julius Caesar was a family friend. Julius Caesar took it in stride. He didn't, he had a very good attitude about it, and he probably knew being a political public figure was going to mean that he was going to get some pushback, right? He was going to get some people who criticized him and didn't agree with him on everything. And especially since Catullus's family was family friends, he seems to have not taken it as a personal affront. But Catullus did write into the current political and social reality of his day. Not works we tend to read very much now because they were very pertinent to that time, and they don't kind of have that universal and timeless appeal the way his love lyrics do. But still, he was involved and engaged in the political situation in his day. Another thing that he writes is a mini epic. So, many ancient Greek poets, and then we have Virgil a little bit later, who write these kind of grand epics. Catullus doesn't undertake the same level of thing, but he does write a mini epic that is about the marriage of Peleus and Thetis. And you will remember that those are Achilles' parents. Peleus was a mortal king and Thetis was a minor sea goddess. Of course, then their son plays a major role in the Trojan War. But beyond that, it's the marriage of Peleus and Thetis that kind of sets the events that lead to the Trojan War in motion. So Catullus is kind of almost writing a prequel to the Iliad, right, in this mini epic. He's kind of writing how did this all get started, right? Some of the information that Homer only kind of alludes to in the Iliad, Catullus is addressing head on. And you may remember that it's at the marriage of Peleus and Thetis that the goddess of discord throws in a golden apple that says to the fairest of them all, and 3 different goddesses claim that the apple belongs to them. And then there's this whole beauty contest thing, and Paris is called in to decide, and he chooses Aphrodite because she promises to give him Helen as his wife. And that's how the whole thing leading to the Trojan War begins. And so Catullus is kind of bringing all of that up to kind of serve as a prequel to the Iliad. Catullus also wrote some cultural and travel pieces. So as he was kind of traveling around, he did do some traveling during his life. He went to Bithynia with a governor there on his staff. And so he did some different traveling, and he wrote a couple pieces about different cultures and his travel. One piece he wrote was on the worship of the goddess Sibyl that was kind of done in the East, and he saw that kind of as a savage sort of worship. And so he kind of wrote about that because it was different and exotic and intriguing to the people in Rome. And he also did that in a more Eastern style. He used some of the exotic Eastern rhyming schemes that were not really native to Rome, but were more from the East where he had been traveling. He also just wrote a travel journal about his journey to Bithynia. It's very ironic. He kind of makes fun of himself in a lot of places. He's self-deprecating. It's satirical. And was beyond just a record of his travels, but was really a kind of a humorous piece as well. So from all of his works, Catullus emerges as one of the most prominent Roman poets, as accomplished, as learned, and he really rivaled many of his Greek predecessors, including people like Sappho and Pindar, with the skill of his verse and really just the enduring legacy of his reputation. And this is all done during a rather short life. He died sometime in his 30s, so he didn't live super long, but left a lasting impact with his poetry, even despite the fact that he had a fairly short life. All right, so we're going to go over some basic information about the poems, and then I'm going to include them below the video for you to read and to take a look at. So, but I'm going to give you a brief rundown of just kind of the progression. We're going to look at some poems that trace the progression of his relationship with Lesbia. We're not going to look at all of them, but we're going to look at some from kind of different stages in the development of that relationship. And then one that's about something completely different, because he does have some poems that are more about friendship or family and those sorts of things. They're not all love lyrics. As a quick note of review. We talked about lyric poetry when we were talking about Greek literature, but I just wanted to take a few minutes to review lyric poetry, reminding you that lyric poetry is poetry that has a musical rhythm, probably was originally sung to the accompaniment of a lyre, and so that is the reason why we call the words and songs lyrics, and it derives its name from the lyre, from that instrument. And lyric poetry typically explores very strong emotions, very often romantic feelings, but not always romantic feelings. We saw that Sappho explored other feelings besides romance in her poetry, and Pindar wrote victory odes that were lyric poetry as well. But they do typically express very strong emotions, whether or not that's romantic. So the first poem you're going to look at by Catullus, many times they're just numbered. We'll refer to them by their first line. That's another typical way that you refer to unnamed poems. And Catullus didn't name most of his poems. So the first one that you're going to look at is "My woman says there's nobody she'd rather marry." And in this one, you will see that the relationship is going well, and Catullus is very excited by his relationship with Lesbia, and he's very much in love, and he feels like that is returned, and so that brings him joy. You can probably detect a shift in the relationship in the title of this next poem, "I Hate Her and I Love Her," which is exploring just the fact that he's kind of been burned by her, right? She's toying with him, and so he does love her, but he's also experiencing mixed emotions about his relationship with her, and at moments he hates her. And so he's kind of in the midst of a struggle. Then you will also look at a poem, "I Crossed Many Lands and a Lot of Ocean," which is about the death and funeral of his brother. And he expresses a very different emotion here, an emotion of grief. And so we see that he's capable of exploring very, very powerful and strong emotions besides romantic love in this poem. Lastly, you'll look at "My mind's sunk so low, Lesbia, because of you," in which he just kind of admits the bitterness and depression that he's feeling since he's been kind of fully and totally rejected by Lesbia, that she doesn't want to have anything to do with him anymore. And he's just hurt and depressed and angry. So one thing to keep in mind as you're reading this, right? Catullus definitely finds that the meaning of Proverbs 5, 3, and 4 is true. Of course, he probably did not know Proverbs. He was not a Christian. He wasn't a Jew. He probably wasn't aware of the Hebrew scriptures. And so he certainly was not living by them. That's pretty obvious. But I think that he learns kind of the same lesson that God tries to forewarn us about at a number of places in Proverbs. There's actually a lot of Proverbs that talks about the issue of adultery and being unfaithful and the pain and hurt and ruin that that brings. And I think from a completely different source, we can find in Catullus some support for the truth that God presents in Proverbs to us about adultery and not following God's design for marriage. And I think that can really be brought to the forefront by Catullus, even though that wasn't necessarily originally what he was thinking of, right? But as we've talked about before, we can oftentimes find biblical truth in places where we weren't necessarily originally looking for it. And I think Catullus's poetry is one of those places that can give us a little bit of a glimpse into the truth of some of God's word through the experience of someone who had to learn it the hard way. So Proverbs 5, 3-4 says, "For the lips of the adulterous woman drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil. But in the end she is bitter as gall, sharp as a double-edged sword." So this is what Catullus finds, right? At first, everything seemed sweet and smooth and wonderful, and he was so in love and he was so happy to be with her. But in the end, he found out that it was really just pain, right? It was bitterness and sharpness and it was not a good situation, and it left him hurting and angry and depressed, right? And so God, of course, wants us to learn that lesson ahead of time, right? He doesn't want us to have to walk that path in order to experience that and learn that lesson. He wants us to learn that before we cause ourselves all of that pain. And of course, it says the adulterous woman, but this applies to both men and women, right? It's not just the adulterous woman. It's not that it's a female problem, right? There are plenty of men who seduce and um, uh, are the responsible parties in affairs as well. We have to hold people equally responsible. And so this particular verse may refer to the woman, but I think it really applies to all. And I think both God and the proverb writer would admit that it was not just a female problem, but a male problem as well. So as you're reading the poetry of Catullus, be sure to keep that in mind, right? And just see how you can kind of take a lesson away from that. That is a lesson that is also presented in the Bible. All right, there will be more instructions on this assignment about what to do with reading the poetry and other things in relation to Catullus. So enjoy reading books 7 and 8 of the Aeneid, and then also enjoy the poetry of Catullus and the discussion that will generate with your classmates. All right, guys, I will see you later.